official introduction, or?
I'm ready whenever you are, Vieran. Just remind me approximately what time your students are meant to be at liberty, because I do have a habit of being rather long-winded.
Well, let's, 45 minutes and then have time for discussion.
Great.
Or you can, judge by the however many faces you get to see on the screen, or I can send you a note to remind you, but but 45 minutes I think would be.
Why don't you let me know once 45 minutes are up, because I've always had bad luck trying to time myself while also giving the lecture. So that's all I'll ask from you or Luca or anyone out there in the Zoomiverse for that matter.
Okay, well, so I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, Jeremy Walton, a cultural anthropologist whose research resides at the intersection of memory studies, urban studies, and the comparative studies of empire and imperialism. And he is the leader of the Max Planck research group, Empires of Memory, the cultural politics of historicity in the former Habsburg and Ottoman cities. And this is the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen, Germany. And he received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2009. And his first book, which he discussed also in several previous lectures, is Muslim Civil Society and the Politics of Religious Freedom in Turkey. And he's held a number of postdocs and other visiting research fellowships, including at the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka. So an alumni of the University of Rijeka. But again, now what really we want to hear about, and we're very proud to host Jeremy and work with him for his new project, which is an ERC consolidation grant titled REVENANT. So probably less scary than the movie with Leo DiCaprio, but just as interesting, maybe even some huge awards at the end. So anyway, that's my bombastic intro. I'll let Jeremy take over. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vieran. I do recognize, of course, the overlap with that DiCaprio film. I believe he's attacked by a giant bear at some point in it, and I don't plan for that to happen in our version of Revenant. But then again, one never knows. I'm going to leave off any jokes about the Russian bear for the moment. Let me see if I can share my PowerPoint to begin with. Hopefully that will be without, oh, I'm doing it the opposite way around. One has to share first and then go into full screen, I suppose. So just a moment. One always must bear with the technicalities here. How does that look to everyone?
Looks good.
Fantastic. So thank you all, both students of Vieran and colleagues and friends near and far, for joining us and me this afternoon. It is in some ways a form of commemoration and a gaze toward the horizon of the upcoming ERC Consolidator grant project that I will be leading at the University of Rijeka soon, based in the Cultural Studies Department, Revenant, Revivals of Empire, Nostalgia, Amnesia, Tribulation. So in that sense, there is a certain felicitous and even joyful sort of atmosphere, I think, today. Really more so than presenting research that has been completed, I want to provide you with some sense of the continuities and expansions between my current project, the Empires of Memory research group at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, and what will be Revenant once it achieves consolidation as the Consolidator grant in Rijeka. So this is really more of a taster, so to speak, of what's yet to come. Taste, of course, being the sense that I think is, with the exception of smell, least used metaphorically, and so I'm really hoping that taste will be one of the leitmotifs of our entire discussion. And with that, I will move to my introductory slide, which is indeed something tasty. So, as most of you probably know, across the vast and variegated geography of Southeastern Europe, Central East Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, one finds in these very quotidian contexts legacies and memories, and I'll get back to this distinction between legacy and memory soon, but legacies and memories of imperial pasts that are in some ways no longer present and yet take on material form. And this is what has always been the great inspiration and topic that the line or the thread that runs through much of what we do at Empires of Memory and much of what Revenant will also be about. So in, for instance, Vincek, Slastica in Zagreb here, where I'm speaking today, and of course, many of you will know it, you can look at this refrigerated vitrine of delectables and confections on offer. And probably you won't be thinking historically, but if you are, you'll notice an interesting thing. In the upper right-hand corner of the image that I'm sharing with you, you have baklava, but it's not just baklava, it's Turska baklava, Turkish baklava. On the other hand, on the left-hand bottom corner, you see that pink confection, that's bečka kremšnita, Viennese cream cake. So even in a mundane context, albeit one of high caloric content, you can find these legacies that we might not always think of as post-imperial, but indeed there are reasons to articulate and to comprehend them in this way. Now, I don't want to make too much light of this because these legacies are not always something that's so pleasant to taste. I'm reminded now of something that indeed I shared with Vjeran just earlier today, as well as several other colleagues. As many of you, most of you, of course, here in Croatia, all of you in Croatia know, there was a tragic earthquake in Petrinja on the 29th of December. Just a few days ago, the Bishop of Sisak, the Catholic bishop, of course, Vlado Košić, made a comment about the potres. He said, potres je teško predvidiv, ne možemo se protiv njega boriti ka protiv Turaka, komunista ili Srba. So unlike, it's difficult to protect against earthquakes because we can't fight against them as we can against the Turks, the communists, and the Serbs. They're nicely wrapped up in a single xenophobic statement. You have the historical enemy, the Turk, the political enemy, the communist, and the ethnic enemy, the Serb. Now, obviously, this is not merely an imperial legacy, but it's the sort of kind of politics of memory in everyday speech, one that's more sort of violent in this case, that also inspires me, as I know it does Vjeran and so many other scholars in this field. So just to give you a sense of what we've already done, to look to the past before we envision the future, my Empires of Memory research group at the Max Planck Institute, and it's such a great pleasure to see so many affiliates and contributors to our research joining us here today as well. I've lost you now because I can only see a few names here on the screen, but I know that some of you are here. Was and is, since it will continue at least for another 9 months or so, an examination of the neglected and yet rich geography of inter-imperial and post-imperial past stretching from Vienna to Istanbul, anchored by those 8 cities, Vienna, Budapest, Trieste, Zagreb, Sarajevo, Belgrade, Thessaloniki, and Istanbul. Of course, these cities were initially chosen, I chose them, so I shouldn't say they were chosen. I chose these cities on the basis of principally of their straddling of this Habsburg and Ottoman geography and history, but also because they straddle other historical divides, most recently, of course, that of the EU, but that of the Cold War, and looking back even further, that of the Byzantine and Roman Empire. So there's quite a lot of rich and laminated material pasts available for speculation and theorization in this area. And I imagine I'm preaching to the choir a bit there. So that's really been the anchor of our research so far. It's involved the integration and, in some sense, forging of a capacious and what I hope is a flexible and indeed multidisciplinary perspective on how to understand the past as it exists in the present. So inspired by a variety of theorists and writers, some of whom you will surely be familiar with, collective memory, sites of memory, Halbach, Nora, we don't need to rehearse these memory studies, titans probably at this point. Svetlana Boym's evocative distinction between restorative and reflective nostalgia in her fine book, The Future of Nostalgia. And Laura Stoller, an anthropologist who's written quite brilliantly on imperial formations and the duress that continues to result from them. And this is where I pick up my own theorization of legacy, but I'll get to that more in a moment. Michel Raff-Triot, Marc Auger, also anthropologists examining how silencing, erasure, oblivion, amnesia are crucial to the ways in which the past shapes the present, as well as memory and commemoration. From Freud, I take the point through his theory of a melancholy and ambivalence that longing for an object that is no longer present can sometimes occur, often does occur, on a deeply unconscious level that can resist conscious articulation. So this is again a sort of repost to some of the more triumphal claims of memory studies, you might say. I could talk more about a Freudian perspective on collective memory if you'd like in our question and answer. Critical heritage studies, particularly Sharon McDonald's wonderful work. She leads the Karma Center in Berlin, which has been one of our key partners, the Center for the Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage. Walter Benjamin, in some sense, is the guru or the sheikh of me anyhow, and therefore of the project and project to come. His notion of bringing together constellations of the past and present as a way of offsetting this sort of historicist simplistic notion that time is linear, like the beads on a rosary, as he so poetically writes. And I've tried to theorize this in my own writing through the concept of what I call textured historicity. Again, I'm not necessarily entirely tied to this concept, but it means to highlight the distinctive and embodied encounter between subjects in the present and objects that convey the past in the present. So, just to continue a bit more with some of this conceptual framing, for the purposes of this presentation and also for Revenant, it's particularly the notions of the inter-imperial and the post-imperial and their relationships to questions of legacy and collective memory that I want to emphasize. So from Laura Doyle, who coined the term inter-imperiality, I take inspiration in examining those interstices, but also points of contact and mutual configuration between empires. She does this in a manner that befits her own disciplinary home in comparative literature, but it's one that we can take and I think export to other disciplines. She just published with Duke a volume on this, which you can see perhaps in my slide, Inter-Imperiality. On the other hand, Anne-Laura Stoller and her notion of imperial formations, which really registers, as she writes, the ongoing qualities of decimation, displacement, and reclamation that endure beyond formal exclusions, that endure beyond the formal polities that we call empires. So that's really what I consider to be a sort of capacious understanding of what a legacy might be. I've now somehow done something to my Zoom screen that doesn't allow me to see any of you. So I really am just talking at my computer now. Hopefully that will not result in too negative an effect on my prosody. We'll see. So again, this is something that I've been working on recently, actually, in particular, in an essay that I'm writing about Mirogoj Cemetery here in Zagreb, another one of my many small projects. A distinction between legacies and collective memories that essentially proposes legacies as the pressure that the past exerts on the present, whereas collective memories are the pressure that the present exerts on the past. So you can see the dialectical nature of this. It's a very abstract definition, but it is one that I think might work well in certain ways. Just to give you a sense of this in a more grounded way, where does one find something that one could call an inter-imperial legacy and a post-imperial memory? Well, as it happens, and I do believe my father has been so kind to join us today in the lecture, when he was last able to visit Zagreb, where I live with my family, if it wasn't already obvious, last January, we managed to go to the ethnographic museum where there was a an exhibition on headgear, and some of the most brilliant pieces were these bridal headdresses from the 19th century, mostly from Bosnia. You see one of them here, and in the single headdress, you have these both Ottoman kurush and Habsburg thalers featuring Maria Theresa displayed. So there's something that is clearly an inter-imperial legacy. It was at the intersection of these two empires and their currency, their ducats and their dinars, that allowed something like this to come into being. Of course, they're being framed in a museum context as a certain type of memory. Now, I don't want to make too many strong claims about what that memory is, because I think that's very contextual, but I think you get the sense, the flavor, to maintain the culinary and savory metaphor of the sort of research we're doing. So now I want to move on, if I can, there we go, to discuss the overarching frame for the research that REVENANT will conduct. And this is essentially I'm just making sure I have all my notes at hand, essentially a summary of much of the sort of heuristic that I provided in my ERC application. We want to examine how collective memories and legacies of the former empires of Central and Southeast Europe, Eurasia, and the Middle East, that is to say the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Romanovs, how these memories and legacies achieve articulation through ensembles of persons, places, and things. So as you can tell, I think in threes. Within these categories, we have three different types of post-imperial persons, three types of post-imperial places, and three types of post-imperial things. So rulers, consorts, and rebels, centers, ports, and frontiers, and relics, commodities, and memorials. We're going to go through all of these quickly, and then if time allows, I will hopefully be able to offer at least a little bit of a sense of how this would work in practice with regard to one of each of these categories of post-imperial persons, places, and things. So I'm always having trouble moving from slide to slide. There we go. Post-imperial persons. To begin with, we have, of course, the rulers. And it's not surprising that the potentates, the kaisers, the tsars, the padishahs, and the sultans would be key to a project such as this on the continuing ways in which empire is understood and materialized in the present. So here, oh yes, I've done something rather silly, haven't I? We have a picture of Suleiman the Magnificent by a follower of Bellini. So Suleiman, I should say, Suleiman, Peter the Great, and Franz Josef will be the three sort of primary rulers that will anchor much of this consideration. I included this picture by Bellini because Bellini himself has become an interesting sort of figure recently in the news. As some of you might know, his portrait of Fethi Mehmet II, the conqueror of Istanbul, was recently purchased from, I believe it was Sotheby's, by the municipality. So this has created an interesting sort of controversy in Turkey that I could talk more about if anyone is interested. You have the Bronze Horseman in St. Petersburg, perhaps not the most famous monument to Peter the Great nowadays. That is probably the gigantic colossus that stands in the Moscow River. But this is an interesting site as well. The rock upon which it stands is in fact the largest single rock ever moved by human beings, evidently, but it was commissioned by Catherine the Great. So already this sort of moment in the late 18th century that's thinking back and historicizing for a sort of imperial grandeur, the early part of the empire. There's more to say about that. And then finally, Franz Josef, my wife, as one part of my birthday present this year, or last year, I should say, reimagined me as Franz Josef. So I wanted to include that as well, if only to offer something a little bit humorous. There's often humor in my presentations after all. Moving on, the second type of persons that we will examine, the consorts. Now, gender memory and post-imperiality is a major field and one that demands much more exploration. There's been some wonderful work done by the likes of Mora Hametz. I don't know if Mora is with us today or not, but in general, I think there's much more to be done there. Of course, some of the rulers of the Romanovs and the Habsburgs were women, most notably Catherine the Great and Maria Theresa, but the women that are sort of the most iconic figures of the empire arguably usually are not the rulers, but rather the consorts. So here you see Meryem Üzerli, who was, the series is over, played Hürrem Sultan Roxalana on the soap opera The Magnificent Century, which has gained a worldwide audience for Turkish soaps in general. You have Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, who was the consort of the final Romanov Tsar, Nicholas II, and also the object of intrigues on the part of Rasputin, most famously. You have Kaiserin Sisi, who is perhaps one of the most well-studied consorts in this field, but still worthy of further study. I can show you here, well, maybe I'll have to do it later since you're looking at my screen. I have a bottle of Sisi Brut champagne that I purchased at the Hofburg that I thought I'd bring out as part of my show and tell for the lecture. Now, in addition to questions of gender, femininity, and consorthood, it's interesting that these three figures also raise questions about what it meant to be, one doesn't want to say native, but internal to an empire, because they were each in some sense foreigners, as you probably know. Hürrem Sultan Roxalana was originally from a Ruthenian background in what is nowadays Ukraine. Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, but also the heiress to a smaller dynasty in Hesse in Germany. And finally, Kaiserin Sisi, Elizabeth, was a Bavarian princess. So none of them were in fact from the empires and dynasties into which they married, which of course makes sense in that imperial model. Finally, the post-imperial persons, the rebels, in some sense my favorite of these three categories of post-imperial characters, but also one of the more difficult ones. Here you see graffiti featuring the three post-imperial rebels that we'll examine more closely. Gavrilo Princip makes a lot of sense, of course, in this context. You can see the graffiti in Belgrade there, which contains his famous words. Let me see if I can make out the Cyrillic. It's often a little bit difficult. Naše će sjene hodati po Beču, lutati po dvoru, plašiti gospodu. So our shadows will walk through Vienna, wander through the castle, and scare the gospodu, the nobility. Lenin as a post-imperial rebel. Well, obviously, you know, someone like Lenin, or for that matter, someone like Ataturk, it's not going to be within the remit of a project like this to conduct a thorough biography of these immense figures, but rather to examine how and where they intersect with questions of how the empires are considered today. I included this rug of this Oriental style rug of Lenin merely because it's one of those objects that I find quite provocative. With Ataturk, this is a photograph that I took of his wax figure in the museum that occupies his birthplace now in Thessaloniki, one of the sites that has and will continue to be interesting in this broad constellation of research. So moving on to the second tripartite category, post-imperial places that we will examine as part of REVENANT. Clearly, the former capitals of the empires, Istanbul, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, will play a major role, though not only those three cities. In addition, we'll examine previous capitals, so in the Ottoman context, Bursa and Edirne. In the Romanov context, of course, Moscow plays a constitutive role in relationship to St. Petersburg as both its predecessor and successor. And with regard to the Habsburgs, Budapest, after the era of the dual monarchy in 1868, also has this counterbalancing role to Vienna. There's something to be said. Now, these are just random images that I've selected for your enjoyment, but there is something particular to be said about the way in which that fin de siècle, late 19th, early 20th century moment, which you see embodied in Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg here, this Art Nouveau architecture, the way that that comes to really ground images of these cities in the present. Of course, Karl Schorsky has written about this quite provocatively and influentially with regard to Vienna. More recently, Nora Onar Fischer has a volume about Istanbul that makes a similar argument. So there is something about why that moment is so important to this moment that I think we could examine. Post-imperial ports. Port cities have a certain sensibility, perhaps affective, perhaps material, that has always appealed to me. And I've already written a bit about certain port cities, particularly Trieste and Thessaloniki. And port cities will continue to provide one of the modes of inquiry into the different forms of post-imperial memory and legacy for REVENANT, precisely because the landscapes of the past that inhabit port cities, both socially and architecturally and materially, tend to be rather different from those in the capitals. So here you see, I've again just chosen 3 images to illustrate the 3 cities that will anchor our research. Rijeka, Fiume, in this image of a Habsburg era stamp. Now, I chose this in some ways to be provocative because, of course, there's nothing here that one could identify with Rijeka. As those of you who are in Rijeka especially will know, I believe it's in fact the parliament, that Gothic parliament building on the Danube in Budapest that you see on the stamp there. And of course, this is a stamp from the Hungarian half of the empire with the Italian name, an interesting object to say the least. You have the Potemkin stairs in Odessa, made most famous perhaps by Eisenstein's wonderful battleship Potemkin, and then finally the White Tower in Thessaloniki, which I've written a little bit about and can talk more about as a sort of silenced site of Ottoman memory, even as it is a symbolic embodiment of the city today. Finally, frontiers. This is, again, obviously, there's a certain level of generality to the project in which we're not going to be able to touch on all of the debates that concern questions of imperial frontiers and their aftermath. And yet, these areas that Omer Bartov and what's the surname, Eric Weitz, have so provocatively called the shatter zones of empire, continue to form repositories for memories and legacies in ways that other sites of former empires do not. So we have Galicia and Bukovina, which existed at the Habsburg Russian frontier for many centuries. That's in the top left here. We have, of course, the Balkans, which, as Maria Todorova has famously proclaimed, shouldn't be thought of as an as a site for Ottoman legacies, because the Balkans are an Ottoman legacy, particularly in their relationship to the Habsburg frontier and the forms of frontier Orientalism that came to exist on that in Andrei Gingrich's language. And finally, the Caucasus, a region that I'm somewhat less familiar with, but as a frontier of the Russians and Ottomans, a place that I'm eager to conduct research. And in this sense, the 3 cities that will be key to our consideration are Sarajevo in the Balkans, Bucharest, which is not, of course, exactly on the Bukovina, it's not in Bukovina or Galicia, but Romania as a nation state coming into being at the intersection of all 3 of the empires. And then finally, Batumi, the port city in Georgia, which was an Ottoman and then Romanov city for many decades. Finally, post-imperial things, in some sense, the tastiest, and we will get back to taste soon. I'll taste my coffee, which we'll get to as well soon. For a pause. Intervening in the broad ebb of material cultural studies, which of course is particularly prominent for anthropology, we're going to examine how different types of objects embody and are understood to be cues for post-imperial memory and legacies. So here you again have 3 exemplary types of objects. Pumarin, the bell in Vienna's Stephansdom Cathedral, which is taken to have originally been forged from the iron salvaged from the Ottoman cannonballs during the Second Siege of Vienna. The Fabergé eggs, a wonderful Easter gift from Tsar Alexander III to his wife Maria Fedorovna, not to be confused with Alexandra, in 1885. And of course, Fabergé eggs are now one of the iconic objets d'art of Russia known across the world, here on display at the Vekselberg Fabergé Museum. Finally, many of you will recognize this, the bejeweled dagger that was ostensibly a gift from Sultan Mehmed I to Nader Shah of the Safavid Empire. So indeed, an inter-imperial object of a certain sort, like Pumarin, which is on display in Topkapı in Istanbul. Now, one of the things that I love about this dagger is that it's so closely affiliated with the film Topkapı, which in its own right is this fascinating sort of condensation of post-imperial legacies. The director of the film was Jules Dassin, of a background of Ukrainian Jews who lived in Odessa. So there you have that connection. The heroine of the film, Melina Mercouri, was a Greek actress and descended of a relatively aristocratic Greek family, but later went on, interestingly enough, to be the originator of the idea of the European capital of culture. So there's a point of contact with Rijeka, although of course, as we know, Rijeka's year as capital of culture didn't quite go as planned, thanks to COVID-19. One point I want to make here is that museums as the institutional homes and showcases for relics will be quite central to our research, and three museums in particular: the Hofburg in Vienna, the Winter Palace, or that is to say, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and Topkapı in Istanbul. I should gesture to Nilay Olzlu's work. I think Nilay is with us, in fact, who has a sort of similar project on Topkapı, the Hofburg, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Kremlin in Moscow. But this is a sort of brilliant way to think about post-imperial palaces as museums and sites for relics that I think offers a lot of potential fascinating argumentation and observation. So moving onward, post-imperial things. And here we come to the commodities, two commodities in particular. I couldn't come up with three for some reason that will ground our research. Food and beverage on the one hand, and souvenirs on the other. So you have an image here of Sachertorte, one of the iconic Viennese and Habsburg confections, originally designed, interestingly enough, or ostensibly originally designed for Metternich, the famous minister of state in that early 19th century era of the Habsburgs, who has recently enjoyed a rather controversial and interesting afterlife, as he's considered to be one of the architects for a sort of Europe that might have presaged the Europe of the European Union. There was a recent essay in the London Review of Books about this. So this is from 1832. We have many different foodstuffs that we will ingest both analytically and, I hope, literally as part of our research. Now, souvenirs, something that I've always been rather fascinated with as material culture. Here I'm thinking of Susan Stewart's wonderful work on the souvenir, the monument. As she writes, the souvenir reduces the public, the monumental, and the three-dimensional into the miniature, that which can be enveloped by the body. In my own recent work, I've talked about the miniaturization of Ban Jelačić here in Zagreb and Croatia more generally. Here you see miniatures on offer of all of the, of both specific individuals and types of figures from the Ottoman Empire at Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. What's interesting, of course, is that they're modeled after the actors and actresses on that serial magnificent century. So Hürrem Sultan Roxolana looks exactly like Meryem Uzerli, not surprisingly, because really that's what the consumer probably is looking for in their miniature. Finally, post-imperial things, memorials. These are the classic sites of memories in Pierre Nora's sense. Again, I've chosen three that will be illustrative and anchoring to our research. The Cheshme column in Tsarskoye Selo outside of St. Petersburg, which commemorates the Russian defeat of the Ottoman Navy in the 1768-1774 Russo-Turkish War, which in fact occurred in Cheshme, outside of Cheshme, which is a resort town in Turkey today, as many of you know. The Heldenberg Memorial in Lower Austria, which includes the grave of Radetzky, the famous military figure of the 19th century, also commemorated in Radetzky's March both the musical composition and then the novel by Joseph Roth. Finally, one of the more fascinating sites, I haven't actually been there myself yet, it's rather embarrassing, but I do think about it a lot, the Gallipoli or Gelibolu Çanakkale Martyrs Memorial. Well, of course, primarily martyrs in the Ottoman martyrs. The martyrs were the Ottoman soldiers who passed away there. Yet this is a site of memory for many nations and individuals, not only or even principally Turks. Of course, Anzac Day being a key national site of mourning and holiday for Australians and New Zealanders, as Ezgi Güner has written about a little bit in some of her fantastic work on African-Turkish relations, both today and also as they relate to histories. There are graves of Senegalese Muslims who were fighting for the French there that have recently become the objects of upkeep for pious Turkish Muslims. So very interesting configurations of mourning and commemoration that one finds there. I don't know exactly how I'm doing on time, Vieran, because as I said, I tend to speak quite lengthily, but it looks like I have a little bit more. I just went back to my desktop to see. So now I want to talk at some length, if not too much, maybe 20 minutes. Does that sound good? 15 more minutes?
10, 15.
I'll do my best.
All right.
About a little more length and go into a little bit more depth about three specific post-imperial persons, places, and things, respectively, each of which I've conducted a bit of research on. Well, two of which I've conducted a bit of research on, and one of which I simply think about a lot in my daily life. Again, as an illustration of the sort of work that we are really aspiring to conduct as part of REVENANT, and which we already do conduct in Empires of Memory. So Nikola Šubić Zrinski, for those of you who are present here in Croatia, he probably doesn't need too much of an introduction. Indeed, in Rijeka, you can find, well, not so much commemorations of Zrinski, but of Ivan Zaitz in the concert hall down by the wharfs. Ivan Zaitz, of course, being the composer who composed the score to the opera Nikola Šubić Zrinski. And I mention that especially because I'm showing you here in this slide a concert poster for the 450th anniversary performance of that opera that occurred at the National Theatre in Zagreb in 2016, sponsored by the Družba Braća Hrvatskoga Zmaja, the association of the Brothers of the Croatian Dragon. I think I forget how they translate it into English. Zrinski is a particularly fascinating character because he occupies this site of memory status for not one or two, but in fact three national cultures of memory, obviously for Croatia, but also for Hungary in a very different sense. There, as you may know, primarily the memory and contemporary concept of Zrinski, or as he's known in Hungarian, Zrínyi Miklós, is mediated by the Hungarian language epic poem that was written by his grandson in the 16th century, The Siege of Sziget, which continues to stand as the iconic Baroque 17th century Hungarian language poem. Finally, of course, for Turks, Zrínyi Miklós or Nikola Šubić Zrinski isn't a household name per se, but in collaboration and conjuncture with Suleiman the Magnificent, he is certainly an interesting figure. Suleiman the Magnificent, as many of you will know, died not of military wounds, but of disease and the rigors of old age during the siege of Sziget, which Zrínyi Miklós, Nikola Šubić Zrinski, was, of course, the antagonist, his antagonist, the defender of the castle. So their deaths together in Sziget, or Szigetbar as it's now known, have become this interesting site for, as you see here, these double busts, the Croatian, Hungarian, Turkish friendship park. that was a Freudian slip adding Croatian in there, though recently commemorated in 2016 by a visit of all three heads of states, though Erdogan wasn't able to make it himself because he'd been distracted by the coup just the month before. So again, this, just to give you a sense of the type of figure who embodies these inter-imperial and post-imperial logics that we're examining. Secondly, a sort of exemplary inter-imperial place, one that I'm writing an essay about well, not literally right now, but working on it during this period in my life, shall we say, the Demir Kilisesi, or Sveti Stefan Crkva, St. Stephen's Church in Istanbul. This is the second St. Stephen to appear in this lecture, incidentally, after Stefan's Dome in Vienna. Some of these coincidences and connections just overwhelm me in their resonance. So, as some of you will know, you'll recognize this fascinating object cast in iron for the Bulgarian community of Istanbul. I should say Constantinople, really, since Istanbul only became the official name in, what was it, 1930. In the 19th century, this in the midst of the internecine politics of orthodoxy, in which the Bulgarian community was increasingly establishing itself in distinction to the nearby patriarchate, which was primarily, of course, a Greek language and Greek institution, and eventually, of course, formed the Exarchate, which existed for some 75 years, I believe, if my dates are right. But as part of that, they needed to establish their own church. Where did they get the church? Well, they first hired one of the prominent Armenian architects of Constantinople at that time, one Hosvep Azvanor, who was eventually to design buildings in Cairo and died. He eventually died there in the 1930s, an interesting sort of post-imperial trajectory of its own. But they had it forged in iron, cast in iron in two halves, in Vienna, and that's what you see here, this R. F. Wagner Vienne, interestingly in French because that was the lingua franca of the day, a steelworks in Vienna, and then the entire church was sent either by way of Trieste, the Adriatic, and then the Aegean, and finally Marmara, or alternatively by way of the Danube and the Black Sea and the Bosphorus. It's unclear exactly which route it took. The bells for the church, as well as the iconostasis, the Orthodox, I don't even know how to define iconostasis, conglomeration of icons that features in Orthodox churches, were created in Yaroslav and I'm getting this wrong, but it's a detail that probably won't matter to too many, basically in the Romanov Empire outside of Moscow. So there in this single building, you have the Romanovs, the Ottomans, and the Habsburgs all represented in interesting ways. An absolutely fascinating site that has again been recruited to this rather sanitized and whitewashed image of post-imperial tolerance in recent years. Erdogan, it was restored with primarily Bulgarian funding in the last decade, and was reopened in 2018 at a ceremony in which Erdogan, as well as the president of Bulgaria, participated, and they hailed, the resurrection of Ottoman era millet-style tolerance in this building, while of course ignoring all of the other things that are not so congenial to that narrative going on nowadays in Turkey. That's another story. Finally, coffee. Now, Giulia Carabelli, a former member of our Empires of Memory group, is really the coffee person to turn to. She's written so brilliantly about the way in which the Viennese-style coffee house circulates as a sort of social space throughout the former Habsburg territories. But it's something that I also think about quite often, usually 2 or 3 times a day. I don't always drink Turkish coffee, which is to say Türk kahvesi or dolmaça kahve or Bosanska kava or Albanian coffee or Greek coffee. You can call it so many things, and that nationalization of a single material object and comestible is one of the things that we're interested in exploring. But some of the iconography that goes along with it is also worth pointing out. So Julius Meinl, founded in 1862 in, yes, of course, Vienna. At the time, of course, it was a little black oriental with a fez as the logo and trademark. work of Julius Meinl. They've since whitewashed that. This whitewashing term is something I draw also from Milos Jovanovic, another alumnus of our project, some of his work. And yet you still have, you know, they haven't entirely erased that Orientalist image. Now, as you know, coffee and its history in Vienna is quite fascinating. It was ostensibly left behind by the Ottomans after the Second Siege, the story of the coffee beans, though in fact it was really on a more sort of historically precise level, an Armenian, Johannes Diodato, who imported coffee beans to Vienna and opened up the first coffee houses. So examining this as a legacy and then also as a site of memory is something that I think is well worth pursuing, and we might do so more. So I'm going to leave it there by way of a conclusion after the cream cake or baklava is finished. I should mention too, I got a wonderful image from my friend and colleague who's now at Rijeka, Kevin Kenyar, who had designed a šahovnica, which is to say the chess pattern that features on so many of Croatian, well, on the Croatian flag and other insignia. It was of baklava and zakar torta. So others are thinking in these ways as well. I thank you all for listening. I'll now maybe stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to your thoughts and reflections and anything else you might have to say.
All right, sorry, I was having some technical issues. So if you have a question, go ahead and put your hand up as Gruya has done. But since Gruya was very quick to the draw, he will go ahead and ask as the first one. But I just want to also just to thank Jeremy for this fascinating presentation of this project. I'm sure there's going to be many more presentations and conferences and workshops and publications from this. The material is, you know, quite overwhelming. And I just wanted to say, you mentioned Pierre Nora and his realms of memory and how focused it was on the nation state, all these objects. I mean, he also looked at, of course, the materiality. And this is fascinating because you're showing this entangled transnational realms of memory and how fascinating it is. And I mean, just all your examples were wonderful. So Gruya, go ahead. And if you have anyone else have questions, send me a chat message directly or raise your hand.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Jeremy, for this wonderful grant. And this is a fantastic project. I look very forward to see how it's how it develops, and it's so entangled and all this transnational flows. Yeah, very fascinating project. I have I'm also very happy that you're also including Romania, which actually I just thought about now, that is the country that combines the three empires. I mean, I'm thinking to find another example, but I think it's that. However, I wanted to ask, why did you choose Bucharest? Because Bucharest somehow doesn't, for Bucharest, its Ottoman past it was not really actually ruled by the Ottomans. It was this vassal state. It doesn't have any impact of the Habsburgs, and only very briefly of the Russians for about 10 years in the 19th century, while it looked towards Paris. So it was a very different connection with France. While if you talk about Bukovina, Czernowitz, for instance, or Suceava could be wonderful places that really show this frontier aspect. So I'm just curious, why did you choose a capital city? Because not all the time capital cities tell the story of countries. And Romania in particular, it's a conglomerate of former territories of empires, and Bucharest is just one tiny part of that, while the frontier is explored maybe better in places like Timișoara or Czernowitz or Constanța or yeah, but thank you very much. And I'm happy that you also include Romania into this discussion.
Gruya, you make me blush because, of course, you point out quite accurately that there is a certain artificialness to some of the choices, and inevitably, when proposing something as ambitious and indeed, in some ways, absurd as this, one's strong suits as well as one's weak suits in terms of previous research and familiarity will inevitably be shown for all to see. And as you know, I haven't conducted any research in Romania thus far. It was one of the oversights of empires of memory that there was not a direct relation there. And so the choice of Bucharest in the initial proposal was really more of a placeholder in some sense to flag Romania as a territory, a nation state, if it is a nation state, I suppose, that integrates all aspects, legacies, and memories of all three empires in a unique configuration. But Bucharest itself, as you note, might not necessarily be the best place to research that. Of course, somewhere like Timișoara would be more interesting for the sort of Ottoman Habsburg configuration. When you move north into Transylvania, that's really getting into the sort of the Habsburg territory. So I was just trying to sort of have a placeholder there in some sense. Chernovitz, of course, is in Ukraine, and I wanted, you have to abide by, on some level, I mean, you don't have to, of course, you can design your research project as you like, but in my sort of attempt to be both schematic and provocative, I wanted to have 9 different nation states represented with 9 different cities that were embodying these different logics, territorial logics of post-imperial legacy and memory, let's say. And so I take your point, and indeed, I hope and assume that since I am guiding this strange vessel forward, I can shift its navigational scheme a bit if need be, and indeed Bucharest may be more interesting, as you have, I know, argued quite provocatively in relationship to the other Parises of the world, and some of those, and for that matter, Paris also provides a sort of formative role for much of what's going on in St. Petersburg. So maybe there's an interesting connection there too. And I guess the final reflection in response is merely that this is meant to be an open-ended and supple model rather than constraining. So if Bucharest doesn't make as much sense, I'm happy to shift. But I do think Romania belongs in this conversation, as you clearly agree. So I hope that we'll be able to, and as one of the advisors and collaborators, you'll guide me effectively, I'm sure.
I'm very happy to continue a conversation about this particular thing.
Okay, Amy has raised her hand.
Hi.
Hi,
Jeremy, I really enjoyed your lecture, and it's just such a joy to be part of this conversation. I was struck by how the examples that you chose from a Turkish perspective, from a Turkish studies framework, would be seen immediately as being interpolated into discourses of nationalism, or the way that those nationalist frameworks have just simply structured how we study Turkey, whether they reinforce the traditional narrative or whether they overtly contest the traditional narrative. I think people in Turkish studies would see that within that framework. And yet what's really refreshing and stimulating about the way you've organized your project is that you have this dance between thinking through locality and place and memory, and then these larger inter-imperial connections that undo nationalism as a meaningful way to think about things that interest me in terms of cultural politics of belonging. And in that way too, it kind of echoes more contemporary studies that are focusing on, undoing nationalism, because there's transnationalism and all these connections between places, especially with regard to the edges of Europe and other regions. So all of this is kind of implicit, is huge critique is kind of implicit really in the way you frame this project, because you've sort of stepped beyond that to examine these historical fruitful connections in other ways, and maybe offer different scalar ways of approaching some of the questions that have driven area studies scholarship for a long time. So I'm wondering if you just would want to reflect on that more explicitly at all. If you think that it seems like there's a rich potential in your project to pose some specific critiques of nationalism studies, and to maybe even in a broader popular way to kind of point new ways forward for imagining how we belong in the world, or like where we've come from. So could you bring this to the question of the cultural politics of belonging and some of those ideas more generally? I'm just curious to hear what you'd say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy. It's really, again, a great pleasure to have interlocutors here in the Zoom room who've also been such inspirations to the work we've done. Streets of Memory, Amy's book on Istanbul, is one that all of you should read if you haven't. Particularly with regard to the Turkish studies context, and I've been thinking about this in a different respect in the last few weeks, and I'm going to digress momentarily as a way of partially addressing the question. There is such a dichotomous logic to the question of whether the research and arguments one makes about the past and its role in the present is confirming or denying this kind of national hegemony. And it's true throughout the Balkans, especially, I think, very difficult to move beyond that kind of dichotomous role. This quote from this Croatian bishop that I mentioned at the beginning suggests certainly that nationalism remains for many, not for all, but for many, the primary prism through which belonging and the cultural politics thereof is understood. And we see that, of course, in a different way in the Capitol on the 6th of January in Washington, D.C. So this is certainly something that, however much I think it's easy for scholars such as ourselves to sneer at nationalism, and I do myself, it requires something more sophisticated than simply a sneer. And I think that's perhaps why I find this sort of research so productive, because it opens a way for speaking about questions of belonging, legacy, heritage, that don't necessarily have to enter the political binaries in the same way that we're accustomed to. That's very abstract, but let me try to ground this a bit. I've been working on a special section for a special issue of the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association on Hagia Sophia recently, which any of you who are interested in Hagia Sophia, its recent reconsecration as a mosque, and the more, I mean, in terms of provocative sites of memory, there are hardly others that occupy that sort of major role in Turkey and even globally. And even in these essays by very, very subtle historians, sociologists, anthropologists, the dichotomous logic of, is it a national or an imperial site? If it's an imperial site, what empire should it privilege? Comes through very clearly, and it's very difficult to think beyond that. So again, I don't necessarily have a single and simple answer to this, because it's not a simple question, but it is the right question, I think. And it's one that perhaps I haven't addressed as directly in this presentation and in some of our work, because when one focuses on questions of materiality, or for that matter, sites of memory, you in some ways productively, but also potentially troublingly offset those questions of belonging and identity for a moment. So it's about bringing them in after doing so. And I think you quite nicely are able to do that in Streets of Memory. So I'll end, if not with a totally persuasive answer, at least with a compliment, and hope that that will satisfy for the moment.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, Anush has a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for this fascinating presentation, and congratulations on this next iteration of your wonderful projects. I'm really looking forward to seeing what exciting works comes out of this. I loved the tripartite formulation. I think it's wonderful. One of my advisors back in grad school told me that there's a saying somewhere that a three-legged stool never rocks. So I think that's a great foundation. And I was tickled when you got to the commodities slide and said you hadn't thought of a third one beyond food and souvenirs. So I was just thinking, I was like, oh, he needs a third one. What could the third one be? I thought of clothing might be an interesting combination, especially after you were talking about coffee. Coffee also could be a third one, but with the hat, with the fez, which it comes back in all kinds of different symbolism, not to suggest other things for your project. But another suggestion is, as I was thinking, what comes to mind when I'm thinking about these post-imperial and inter-imperial connections beyond what you've already mentioned, I was thinking of language and how words mix across these different geographies, and music and dance, which is another tripartite formulation, which doesn't fit with the material, but it's more immaterial, which I don't want to add a fourth leg to your three-legged stool, because then it would not be stable. But I wanted to just throw that out there and see how those things might also add. I mean, obviously they'll come in here and there in some kind of context, but yeah, just wanted to add that in, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Anush. That's fantastic. Clothing makes a great sense, and in some ways I'm almost a bit embarrassed that I didn't think of it myself, since I do feature, I mean, if one defines it rather capaciously, then the headdress that I begin with the talers and the kurush might count as well. So clothing it really could work quite nicely. I also, I'm just now digressing as a way of footnoting myself. One of the more interesting exhibitions that I've seen about Sisi, who will continue to be one of the inspirations of the project, focuses on her couture, both in the Hofburg in Vienna, but there was a traveling exhibition that I saw in Rijeka, in fact, well, Opatia. We're going to count Opatia as part of Rijeka for the project, for those of you who know what Opatia is. The Habsburg Riviera, as they call it. Actually, I want to ask Vieran, was Opatia part of the Hungarian? It was part of the Viennese half of the empire, wasn't it? So it's interesting there that despite being so close to Rijeka, it was a different half of the empire for some 50 years. But in any event, language. This is something that I've always wanted to incorporate into the broad swath of research topics, precisely because it's been something that is so quotidian, in such an everyday way, central to my life. I'll give you again an anecdote because I thrive on them. My children happen to be really fascinated at the moment with several Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and for whatever reason, we were seeking out a Croatian language version of the Hansel and Gretel, Ivica and Marica, but we found a Serbian language one instead. And so at some point in the Serbian language fairy tale, rather than the phrase a piece of bread, which in Croatian would be komad kruha, they say parcha hleba. Now hleb, I'm not sure what the origin of hleb is, but it's Russian. I mean, it's the Russian word for bread as well. But parcha is clearly from Turkish, right? So these little moments where you have these Turkicisms, or from the other direction, Germanicisms. Of course, you have a lot of Hungarian words coming in. It's constantly something I'm commenting on, precisely because I'm speaking to some degree a battered and rather ugly form of Croatian, which probably sounds more like Serbian or Bosnian, because I will use a Turkish word whenever I can. So trying to incorporate that is really quite a priority for me, and again doesn't quite fit into these three-legged stools that you pointed out, but I think there are ways that it can be done. One of the, I'm going to stop there with that. But then music and dance, again, great suggestions. Music, in particular, the way in which, on the one hand, of course, Vienna, you speak about Vienna and you're immediately immersed in some of the, classics of the classics, whether it be the Blue Danube or Mozart's from Salzburg, but they're all Viennese. On the other hand, you have something like Uskudara Giderken, which has been shown to circulate this folk song across the Mediterranean in a variety of different languages and versions. So for that matter, I don't know if Kevin is with us or not, Kevin Kenyar, but thinking about the connections even between something like fado in Portugal, this sort of notion of saudade and the way it comes in to sevda music in Bosnia, huzun in Turkish. I mean, there are these connections that, you don't want to reduce them to some sort of imperial legacy, but they do come through. Dance is, again, somewhere that I'm, this would be not sort of my first calling card as a scholar, but it's another great suggestion. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Okay, Amaura had a question about Rijeka and Rijeka's role in the project, I think.
So thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me and for actually having us all. It was a fascinating layout of the project. And I might also add an idea about film and photograph, if you want to think about other.
I proposed a film and photography exhibition, so the ERC will be asking about it indeed.
I mean, coming from the CC perspective, obviously, right? That's key. But really, one of the things that struck me is I wondered if you could put in broader perspective how you see Rijeka as a central part of the project, and talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
So obviously Rijeka will be the home of the project, and in that sense, it plays a dual role as both host and object of study. I haven't fully, beyond the sort of broader sort of port cities concern that will guide some of our research, I haven't fully developed my perspective on Rijeka. I'm confident that I'll have time to do that in Rijeka. I mean, I'm more familiar with Rijeka than I am with many of the other cities and contexts of the project thus far. I think, you know, Trieste, as you know, has been a site of great fascination and revelation for our Empires of Memory project. And in some sense, I hope that Rijeka will sort of play that role in the new version of REVENANT. Rijeka and Trieste themselves obviously make a very interesting pair. Trieste and Thessaloniki in the initial Empires of Memory, I do tend to think about the relationships among these sites rather than one site in particular, as you can tell as I'm speaking. But for the initial Empires of Memory project, the relationship between Trieste and Thessaloniki as sites that were formerly definitively plural linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and therefore demographically in various ways, that have since been rendered relatively homogenous in 20th century nationalism, due to 20th century nationalisms, was a major theme. And I think Rijeka can fit into that as well in terms of examining how the processes of nationalism, and several nationalisms, not only one nationalism, have rendered a certain type of city available and existent in the present. On a much more specific level, I've always, of course, been somewhat fascinated by D'Annunzio and the brief independent, what was it? Specifically, Independent Republic of Rijeka, Fiume, not Rijeka. So again, you know, there might be a way in which D'Annunzio, as I said to Amy, you know, this is really meant to be more, or maybe it was to Gruya. This is really meant, I think it was to Gruya. In fact, this is really meant to be more open-ended, and the model that I provided is meant to be open-ended and therefore adjustable. And D'Annunzio is a figure who could figure in a broader sort of study of post-imperial personalities. You know, what does comparing D'Annunzio, Oberdan, and Princip, for instance, give us? It might be an interesting essay, right? Oberdan, incidentally, being the Triestine Slovenian German Italian who tried to assassinate Franz Josef in the late 19th century and is still commemorated in the Piazza Oberdan. And I haven't actually been to that museum there, but I do need to go once COVID allows, because I want to write a little something about Oberdan too at some point. But so these were very, very anecdotal answers. In my own time in Rijeka, I haven't actually written anything about Rijeka, but I have, as I always am, been attracted to these sites that, at least initially, upon encountering them, push against more homogenized images of the city and the nation. So in Rijeka, in particular, there's a wonderful sort of, and I'm thinking now of the work of Maximilian Hartmut, who gave a wonderful lecture for our group recently, and his work on sort of late Habsburg, particularly Bosnian Orientalist style architecture. There's this building down by the docks, not so far from Ivan Seit's the Ivan Seitz music hall. What do you even call that? Auditorium? I don't know. Concert hall. That is the former site of the Ottoman consulate in Fiume that has been restored with funds from Turkey, of course, and is now, there are plaques there in Croatian, Turkish, and maybe even I don't think they are in Hungarian. But so the genealogy of a building of that sort would be quite fascinating to me. On the other hand, the Orthodox churches in Rijeka have also always been quite fascinating to me, both the one in Fiume proper and then also the one on the way up to the university in remind me again, Vieran or
Sushak.
Sushak, yes, in Sushak, thank you, that's the word I'm looking for. So there are other, of course, sites such as this as well that one could think of, I'm sure.
Do we have any more questions? We are coming to the...
I wondered in that context, Jeremy, if you had thought about Pula and Dubrovnik, because Pula would give you a really interesting comparison as a center for the empire, like the empire, because of the military it created.
I was in Pula just a few weeks ago, in fact, and reminded yet again why Pula also should be playing a role in all of this. As it happens, I've written a little bit about the naval cemetery, very briefly about the naval cemetery in Pula, and I have this cemetery's my morbid fascination. Miragoi, the Zeytinlik Memorial Cemetery in Thessaloniki, but also several others that are part of a small sort of Cities of the Dead project. And interestingly, I've actually wanted to write about Dubrovnik cemeteries as well, which are a sort of contrast to, well, particularly Miragoj, but also for that matter, the Pula's military cemetery. What I haven't actually done is visit the cemeteries in Rijeka, so I should do that. But Dubrovnik and Pula definitely both also provide very interesting. I mean, Pula as the military naval port, as opposed to the commercial ports of Trieste and Fiume, is I mean, that sort of triad is a fascinating one as well. Of course, all of this is leaving out, in some ways, the Romanov and Russian aspects of the project, which, again, these are ones that will be newer to me, and I'm lucky to have the opportunity to yet again, in a rather quixotic fashion, expand the research palette. So what does a comparison of Odessa and Batumi give us, for instance, vis-a-vis St. Petersburg? That's, again, I'm not necessarily the most qualified person to address that question, but hopefully there will be those who will be involved in the project.
Yasenka has a question.
Hi, thank you, Jeremy, for this wonderful presentation of this very exciting ERC project. As your fellow ERC grantee and architecture historian, my question would be, how do you intend, after mentioning the churches and the other buildings, how do you intend to incorporate the architectural history within your very broad discourse? And this leads to my second question: what kind of team did you envision for your project? Thank you.
Thank you, Yasenka. I should also acknowledge, again, it's a great gathering of colleagues who've been so supportive and kind in offering their time and thoughts about the project, and Yasenka's definitely one of them. Architectural history, well, as I've said somewhat jokingly in different contexts, and some of you may have already heard it, so forgive me for repeating my own jokes, but I do think of myself lately as an anthropologist who had to become a historian who wanted to be an who had to become a historian who wanted to be an architect. That's how I often put it. So inevitably, I think when I sort of dabble in architectural history, I do become a bit dilettantish and amateur. But I've, for instance, with regards to the Iron Church, the Sveti Stefan Cerkva in Istanbul that I mentioned at the end of my lecture, essentially everything that has been written about that that I've been able to find in English or in Turkish, and there's one volume in Turkish essentially, has been written by architectural historians. So in some sense, a lot of these sites are really only available to scholars through the scholarship that art historians have done. I rely a lot on that in terms of the actual sort of, phenomenology of the building, as it were. I'm not the sort of person who can make innovative claims about transitions from, the Iron Church is an interesting one because there's some debate over whether it should be considered neo-Gothic or whether it's a sort of hodgepodge of neo-Renaissance, neo-Gothic, and something else. And these are not the debates primarily that I'm interested in, but I benefit immensely from that ability to have, a clear sense of the research that's been done on these structures that then I take and make arguments that really have more to do with their emplacement in broader discourses about the cultural politics of belonging on some level. I do want art historians involved in the project, and in fact, art historians, as you know, I think have been some of the most valuable interlocutors for Empires of Memory as well. Here in Zagreb, Dragan Damjanovic has been really forthcoming and helpful in his research on Herman Bolle, who is of course central to anyone who wants to talk about Mirogoj, which I do. In some sense, assembling a research group like this is all about the serendipity of new relations across disciplines. And that's how it's worked with Empires of Memory. I didn't really know exactly what kind of profile of scholar would be interested. And as it turns out, there are many. So I'm hopeful that we will have, in addition to art historians, scholars of literature, anthropologists, of course, sociologists, historians, basically a sort of grab bag of the humanities and social sciences who are interested in these questions, which really do span disciplines, I think. So that's a very general answer, but hopefully sufficient.
Any final comments? We've kind of reached the end of the time we have. Unless there are any, oh wait, Kevin wants to say something. All right.
Hello. Just want to say excellent project. Everything looks perfect. I do want to mention with the coffee, kind of brought to mind, when I had first moved from Bosnia to Belgrade, after living for many years in Croatia, I went to a cafe and ordered bosanska kava. And I got this weird look, and I'm like, oh, izvini, turska, and got a domaća, only to go the next week to Thessaloniki, where
you had a frappe.
Had a frappe, and at the hostel, I was given a menu, and in Greek, it had Hellenikas kafis, Greek coffee, with the English translation, Turkish coffee. So.
The English translation, Turkish coffee.
I was going to say, I came across this little excellent book here of Turska Kuća, and it
that's exactly what I was mentioning. Indeed, I didn't realize there was a book about it. This is the former consulate of the Ottomans in Rijeka.
Exactly, and I guess the first consular was actually Greek, and so the book has little translations of the Ottoman Turkish inscriptions above each window. And here you see Nikolaki Efendiya Nikolaitis written in Ottoman Turkish. And apparently he was married to a Croatian woman. So anyway, just wanted to share some resources, and good luck with the project.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing Turska Kuća. If I may, as a sort of parting gesture, I also wanted to, even as I was speaking, I was reminded of an image that I wanted to share, and this will be by way of making a sort of final point. One of the criticisms that I received from the ERC committee, which thankfully wasn't sufficient to entirely sink the good ship Revenant, but I've taken on board, and it's a criticism that has actually been raised of Empires of Memory as well, is that contemporary political, and by political I mean statecraft and its relationship to the former empires is something that we don't focus on enough. And so I think I had a throwaway sort of sentence or two about Erdogan refashioning himself as a sort of postmodern sultan, and Putin, being the heir of tsars. But this photograph, or rather pair of photographs, which I think is a meme, and I'm going to share my screen now again, is perhaps the most provocative of all. So there you have a young Franz Josef and Sebastian Kurz of Austria. So when I saw that, my jaw dropped a little bit, and it's a strange image perhaps to end a lecture on, but obviously these fantasies of imperial continuity are not only those of scholars, they're also driving memes on the internet, not surprisingly. So thank you all again for joining us here this evening, and I do hope that you will all, students and colleagues alike, remain active interlocutors as REVENANT takes shape in the near future. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and looking forward to hosting many more discussions and roundtables, and once we can travel, some in-person conferences. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you, Vieran. I'm trying to download the file of the conversation just so I can respond to anyone whom I didn't have a chance to respond to, but
to save the chat?
Yeah, how does one save the chat?
If you go to the right, there should be 3 dots. Do you have that?
Yes. Save chat. There we go. I'll get back to all of you I didn't have a chance to say hello to soon. Thanks again, Vieran. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Ciao. Luca,